Hi, I'm Tara, and welcome to Let's Do Books. I'm excited today because Ann McMan is back. She is the author of 11 lesbian fiction books, all of which I love, and you all know that because I won't shut up about them all over the place. The latest book is Galileo, the second Evan Reed mystery. All of her books are available everywhere from Bywater Books. Most of them are available in audio. Welcome, Ann.
Hi, thank you.
So, I did a podcast earlier this year, actually about fluffy romances. I swear I'm going somewhere with this, but I did a podcast earlier this year about fluffy romances.
Is that a category, a new subgenre?
Oh, that's a good point. Okay, so fluffy romances, if you think about it, they are the romances that are angst-free. It's almost like cotton candy in a book. Some people don't love them because all they want is angst. Personally, I love them, especially if I'm having a really bad week. And one of the things that I noticed in a couple of the books is that they were coming with author's notes explicitly saying that they were giving the finger to all the bullshit that was happening in the world. Because writing happy books with very happy endings in the world that we're in now, especially with two women, is a political act. And I mean, writing about women loving women has been a political act as soon as it started anyway. And I was thinking about how there's been this evolution of it, and we go from The Well of Loneliness, which is about as depressing as you can get, and you get to say the likes of Ann McMan, who for people who listen to the podcast will remember she was on earlier this year as well, talking about what those books were doing for people. And you can take that to Curious Wine, to Karen Callmaker, and then to other, Marianne K. Martin, and then other romance authors. So you get to these coming out stories, and kind of we're past coming out stories, and now it's there's just happy stories. And I thought, how wonderful. But then I thought, on the flip side, there are also people like you who are writing overtly about politics as well. Sometimes it's a major theme, and sometimes it's not a major theme. So I don't have a lot of specific questions. I was thinking this could be kind of an unstructured conversation, but I wanted to start just by asking, why do you write about politics in your books, even the romances?
I think, for me, I think it's because I believe for myself that as a writer, I have a responsibility to do that. And the avenue that is available for me to tell my stories and have them available to readers is one that requires me to write within a certain genre. The lesbian literature genre is the avenue I've chosen, and it's the avenue that is open and available to me. So that's the vehicle I have. And the stories I feel compelled to tell need to fit within that framework. But I believe that I have a responsibility to myself and to other women who I know are like me and who have had and have parallel life experiences, to talk about issues and themes that transcend romance and sex. And I think it's important to show that as complete people, all of those things can coexist, and that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. That I don't have to write a story that does one thing or the other, that I can try to tell what I believe to be an important story about real people dealing with real issues that also includes some of the other happier elements that, that's why I do it. And I try to do it in a way that doesn't beat readers up, that doesn't take an issue that's uncomfortable and grind their faces into it. It's not my goal or my desire ever to do that. But it is I believe, my mission to write about real things and real people living real lives who also manage to find, hopefully, love and companionship along the way.
So the first book that I was thinking of when I was kind of mulling this topic over was Beowulf for Cretins, because it is also what I would classify as a fluffy romance. There's not a lot of angst between the two of them. There are questions of, whether they can make this work for various reasons. I'm trying to avoid spoilers. But you don't have the dramatic, we're going to have a very terrible, messy breakup only to have to get back together. Like it's quite lovely. But at the same time, there is that thread of the brother-sister relationship. And I think we all see on our Facebook, unless you all have wildly different Facebooks than I do, people saying that they had family relationships fall apart, best friend relationships fall apart when people in their lives voted on the opposite side of the political spectrum from them. And I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about that and how that came about.
About in Beowulf, about Grace's relationship with her brother Dean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I depicted Dean intentionally to be kind of the not just political, but like the antithesis of Grace in almost every way. She's an academic, he's a non-academic. She has liberal ideologies, he has conservative ideologies. He voted for Trump. She's very upfront about saying that, that he's got Trump stickers all over his big macho Hemi-powered pickup. And then she is forced to come to terms with the fact that her best friend, who is also the antithesis of her brother Dean, is engaging in a very lively and energetic sexual relationship with this man with whom she has nothing in common. And Grace has to find a way to come to terms with that. But beyond that, Grace has no illusions about the differences she and her brother have, but at the same time manages to connect with the things in him that transcend their differences. And what I did that was personal was I have two brothers. And the character of Dean is this synthesis of both of my brothers. So I took qualities from each of them and smashed them together into this one man. My brothers and I are complete opposites politically and in terms of our attitudes toward, socialist issues, and even when it comes to religion. But yet we've managed to find our way to respect and value the things we have in common that don't divide us. So I wanted to try to see if it was possible to thread that needle, between Grace and her brother.
Have either of your brothers read any of your books?
One of my brothers reads all of my books, and my other brother has never read any of them. And we don't really have energetic discussions about the books. Like I know that my oldest brother has read them all. And it is, the fact that my other brother, actually the brother I'm probably closer to, not just in age, but in terms of, friendship and kinship. The fact that he has never read any of them is painful for me.
Mm-hmm. Is that because he's just not interested in lesbian books, or is he not a big reader, or?
Oh, no, he is a big reader, but he focuses primarily on nonfiction, on biographies, on his Bible. I think for him, I'm reluctant to put words into his mouth, but I do think it's possible that he subscribes to the love the sinner, hate the sin sort of ideology. So I would suspect he probably has an idea of what he thinks my books are about. And of course they're not. And I think he'd be very surprised to read them and discover that they're not sex throwdowns.
They're really not.
They're really not. In fact, if I can share with you, what I think is a really funny anecdote. When I got the Lambda Award for Beowulf for Cretins, and I was stunned and went up there and tried to cobble together something coherent to say. The one thing it occurred to me to say, and fortunately my filters were actually working for once, I was tempted to say, thank you to the judges who had to read 43,000 sex scenes in this category, none of them in this book. One thing I would like to ask you a question when you said you sort of categorized Beowulf for Cretins as kind of being in the fluffy romance category. And I find that really intriguing because I really didn't set out to do that. I mean, I realized that I didn't blow up the relationship between Grace and Abby, but I tend not to blow up relationships anyway, in my books. Mm-hmm. Like I was absolutely adamant that in the Jericho series, I would never do that with Maddie and Sid, to like explode their relationship just so I could bring them back together, because I know that's one of the tropes. But, in Beowulf, what I was really trying to deal with, and maybe it didn't come through, and that could be a flaw of the book, were the issues that Grace struggles with that are faith-based. The whole concept of free will versus determinism versus the belief that there is a personal God who is engaged in ordering events in our lives. That was really the theme of the book.
Well, that's still there. All I'm talking about is when I talk about fluffy romances. And frankly, I would actually say Jericho is one as well. Because it's,
hands down.
It's very much it's them coming together. It's not like we're coming together, we're veering off course, we're back together again. Like, it's also something that I made up. Like, it's not based on, I wouldn't say it's based on any real like industry term or whatever, but it's almost the idea that like you as the reader don't have to go through anything grueling to enjoy the romance. And the best example I can think of that I would bet $1,000 you've read. So I'm going to use it even though I also wouldn't necessarily call it a romance. But if you look at Letters Never Sent by Sandra Moran, there is a gorgeous love story in it. And it ripped my guts out when I read it. That book had a lot of angst. Beowulf doesn't have that. And Jericho doesn't have that. But I do think, as you say, Beowulf has more serious themes. And I think it would be great if you could talk a little bit more about that, like grappling with faith, especially grappling with faith in this world that we're in right now, where it feels like we've made so much progress and we're losing so much progress all at the same time, which I think for a lot of, queer readers is going to resonate with, all of us.
Right. And I think it's true, like if I at least look back over what I would identify as commonalities in all of my books, even the things that are overtly humorous, like the Diz and Clarissa stories. My protagonists all have one sort of big defining thing in common. They're all pilgrims who are wandering through life trying to figure out if there is real meaning. And most of their internal struggles deal with issues of faith in one way or another. They drag, I think of them as people who are going through life dragging their questions about God, and that's what I write about, and that's what I ruminate about. And I've had people ask me before, are you Catholic? Were you raised Roman Catholic? Because so many of my characters are Roman Catholic, but I choose to use that because to me, it's kind of a perfect made to order microcosm of issues of faith. It's got all the elements. It's dark, it's murky, it has history, it has, ideas of a kind of distant, brooding God who is or isn't personal, who can only be accessed through a whole series of mediators. It's kind of like God. It's kind of like, faith at one remove. So even in Beowulf, those are the struggles that Grace deals with. Her moral compass is the voice of the nun, Mary Larry, who's constantly the voice in the back of her head, and all of Mary Larry's little platitudes and aphorisms that are the things that are kind of like Grace's guiding principles. And then 2/3 of the way through the book, when we learn the truth about Mary Larry, Grace's entire cosmology gets exploded. And what is she going to do now that everything she was taught to believe to be true was a lie, wasn't true. And it wasn't true for the person who was drilling that stuff into her head.
Something that I find interesting about that is that I think it is analogous to what happens to a lot of people who walk away from faith. And I'm one of them. I walked away from evangelical faith probably 6 years ago or so. And we're recording this in August for people who are listening. And I think that's important for you to know because you are listening to this in November. But in this past week, I was reading an article about Joshua Harris. Do you know who he is?
No.
He was one of the leaders of the purity culture movement in the 1990s, which one day over drinks, I can tell you all the ways that damaged me so badly, but I'm sure you can also just imagine. And he was the guy who wrote a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And then he did another one after that. I forget what it's called, but it's basically about the idea of courting, and you shouldn't even kiss before you get married, and about how it was a little painful to him. And I haven't read this since, it's almost 20 years. But I remember reading about how it was painful for him to know that his wife had sex before they were married, but he still loves her anyway, and all this really awful. Well, he has renounced all of that. He has apologized for the damage that he has done. He and his wife have amicably split. And recently, he was part of a pride parade. And it was one of those, it just shook me right to the core, because it was this person who was so foundational to so many of the fucked up parts of my brain, saying, I did a bad thing. I was wrong. Now, I don't think Mary Larry said that she did a bad thing necessarily, but it's really interesting to see that, I can definitely identify with Grace and how she goes through that. And you have that way of thinking, and you have these things that you carry with you, and you have these, I refer to it sometimes as almost programming, because you may not even necessarily agree with it when you stop to think about it, but it is those thoughts that come forward. And for people who were raised churched, so much of it comes from there.
Well, and the other thing that's true, because I was raised in a very fundamentally religious tradition, believe it or not. And, things like we went to church 3 times a week. There used to be an old saying that Sunday morning shows how much you love the church. Sunday night shows how much you love the pastor. And Wednesday night shows how much you love the Lord. And that was kind of the tradition I grew up in. And religious themes are pervasive in my books because, to me, those are the archetypal stories and traditions we as a culture share, whether we consciously subscribe to them or not. Those are the myths and the stories and the things that we know, whether we're aware of it or not. Expressions that are common in our language that derive from biblical stories, and things that we understand about love and morality. A lot of those things derive directly from that whole tradition. So those things are pervasive for me, and a lot of what I what I do when I write is I try to work through my own confusion and my own issues with how in the world do I reconcile all of that with what I now understand, not just about the world, but about myself in the world.
How much of that was Backcast?
Oh, 100%. Gosh, there are 13 essays, first-person essays in Backcast, and 10 of them derive directly from my own life. So, there's a tremendous amount of it. And one thing I would say about Backcast, I don't know if I've ever shared this with you. I know we're kind of all over the place, but when I was writing that book, my goal was to write a book that dealt with transitions in women's lives and how different women are either empowered or unempowered by experiences and events they've had and lived through. And I found what I thought was this very humorous vehicle to tell that story, but the real narrative is carried through those essays that each of the women write. And I presented them, those essays, without attribution intentionally, because I wanted to point to the fact that none of us know what the people around us are carrying with them, what their personal experiences are that are very often not reflected by what we show publicly. So I loved the ability to kind of have that tension. And then, when I first wrote the book, I wasn't even sure if I ever would reveal which person wrote which essay. And then I decided that I pretty much had to. But, as I said, the majority of those derived from different life experiences of my own.
I love that book. I mean, you know that, because I think I've told you several times, and not always coherently. But I think that is the thing that I love the most about it. The idea of secrets isn't even necessarily the right way to put it, but it is that we all have our own story, and we choose when and how to reveal it and the extent to which we want to reveal it. And I know for myself, I have parts of my own personal story that I'm sure people are shocked sometimes that I do share because it's so personal. But I also think there's something to the idea of when you tell your own story, nobody can use it against you. And I just think with Backcast, it was really beautiful seeing that play out in the instances when they were able to open up to each other or not, because sometimes it either doesn't feel relevant or it's too much, but it works so well. And I liked how, even though sometimes there were things that were tremendously painful in essays, because there were many essays that carried a lot of pain to them. And actually, you did this with Goldenrod as well, in a different way, of course, because it's a different narrative structure. Very, very difficult, very heavy material at times. And it was almost when I felt like I need to put this down and walk away for a little while, I would start to laugh. Yeah, right. And I do, I know that I when I was at the Golden Crown Literary Society conference in July in Pittsburgh, I sat in on the book club session they had where the group had read Bev Prescott's amazing book, 2 Degrees, which is a phenomenal book about climate change and many other things. But just trying to sit there quietly and pay attention to what, the discussion that people were having about that book, a woman in the group talked about how she didn't often gravitate toward books that had, for lack of better term, more difficult or more serious content. That her first choice would be to pick up a romance and read that. So that it was unusual for her to take on something the magnitude of 2 Degrees. And, to kind of make her point, she said, so, if I'm going to read a book, if I want to read a romance, I'll pick up a book by Melissa Braden or Georgia Beers. If I want to read something funny, I'll pick up a book by Ann McMan.
and went on like that. And I mean, and I know that there was absolutely no desire on her part to say something that would be, wounding or, kind of professionally not offensive. That's too strong a word, but hard for me to hear. But I don't think of myself as a person who writes humorous books, although I know many people do. But I do understand that humor is a convention and a device I use in precisely the way you just identified. How a boxer in the ring will throw sort of fake punches that don't land, and then one hits you. And then they dance around a little while and they parry and they throw punches that don't land, and then they hit you again. And I know that is precisely the kind of method and structure I employ in many of my books, where I'll set up these ridiculous situations that are interwoven with really difficult content. And I do that as a way to not overwhelm the reader and also give them a little breathing space.
Works.
I hope so. And I had an insight about that too. It's really strange for me to be the age I am now. I just turned 64 and have to confront that you can still learn stuff about yourself. I mean, I guess that never ends. But, I grew up I was the youngest of 4 children, and I grew up in northwestern Pennsylvania in a small town in a home that not only was characterized by a lot of adherence to sort of fundamental religious practices, but at the same time where there was domestic violence. My father was an alcoholic. My sister and I were both incest. I'll say victims because we were children at the time. And I believe that probably my brothers were experiencing their versions of the same thing. And I learned, and I now know, that this is a thing that happens in alcoholic families, that very often the youngest children assume the role of what's called a mascot. You become the mascot of the family. You become the person who learns how to diffuse a dramatic situation by being funny. You learn how to make a joke or do some kind of stunt or trick that distracts people from whatever horrible thing they're about to engage in. And I got really good at that. And I've continued to sort of cultivate that. And now I use it in the way I write. From the hard stuff, my job as a writer is to try to entice people to come along with me on the journey and trust that I'm not just going to drop them off in a horrible place and leave them there.
Thank you for being an awesome listener and supporting Tilt, the channel that brings you all the podcasts you want to hear. You're listening to Tilt. Find more podcasts on thelesbiantalkshow.com.
Yeah, I mean, I see when you use the humor, those moments is almost like, that's a great sentence. Those moments are almost like you're just easing off the pedal a little bit. The narrative is still moving forward, but it's starting to almost feel dangerous. As a reader, and I can say this is my experience, so I guess I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, it feels like we're hurtling towards something really kind of uncomfortable, and you ease off the gas, and it's almost just by easing off, it's like, oh, well, this journey is still okay. We can keep going. And you lay it back on again later, but you might ease off again later. It also, I think that happened the most in Goldenrod.
Yeah, with Dorothy.
Yes. And it's so interesting because, like, looking at where that series started, because Jericho really is, it's a straight up romance.
Yeah. And that's, and Jericho's the first book I wrote. And that's exactly what I set out to do. I had been reading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of straight up lesbian romances online, in tandem with thousands of other women who were just discovering the genre and discovering the fact that these stories were even being written. So, I wanted to try to write one myself. So you're absolutely right. That's what it is.
Mm-hmm. But I love that you took a risk. I mean, frankly, you took a major risk when you shifted genres with the series. I don't know that I've ever seen a series shift genres before. I've seen new characters brought in, new settings, but to actually say, okay, this was a romance. We're not going to do more romances here. We're going to make the fiction a little more general, but we're going to keep the same spirit. It was just so good. And especially getting to Goldenrod and kind of back to with the political stuff. I hated that you had to, but loved how you brought in the realities of immigrant families.
Yeah. If you remember, the immigrant family in particular actually appears in Jericho as well. One of the sort of better little subplots in Jericho is the story of how Maddie becomes involved with the couple, and the woman has the baby, remember, and that whole thing, so that those people are kind of on the periphery of life in that community. And then in Goldenrod, I decided to, bring them forward a little bit more again.
Well, and it feels unfortunately, all the more relevant as there continues to be more and more and more of these raids by ICE, because you have that there. You have that with the Christmas tree farm.
That's right. And I wrote that book, gosh, how many? 3 years ago, I guess. 3 years ago. I believe that's right. 3 years ago. 3 years ago. And then to deal with the, I felt really strongly about the character of Buddy, who is on the Asperger's spectrum, but who actually is kind of the conscience of the book. Buddy, more than anyone else, I guess I would say, has my voice in the story, even though he pretty much speaks in his own language, even though he pretty much speaks in code. He is really the one person who brings all of the other people together.
Mm-hmm. So, speaking of current events, we're also recording this on the day that the news broke about Jeffrey Epstein being found dead in his prison cell. Which makes it feel like an awfully on-the-nose time to talk about Galileo. But it would be great if we could talk a bit about... I think Dust is probably one of your also more overtly political books, because Evan Reed is investigating someone who is running for office.
Right.
But would you like to talk a little bit about what Galileo is about?
Sure. Galileo takes place 2 years after the events in Dust. So Evan Reed, the main character, is a dustbuster. A dustbuster in political terms is an individual who does opposition or deep background research on candidates who are going to be vetted for national political office. And she's one of the best in the business. And she gets hired by people from either political party, sometimes to vet opposition candidates, sometimes to look deeply into the background of candidates they wish to put forward, just to make sure they don't come up with anything that will explode the candidacy later on. So that's who she is, and that's what she does. And in this book, Evan is hired by the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, to vet a nominee to the Supreme Court who has just been announced by the president. The nominee is a darling of the ultra-conservative right-wing faction of the Republican Party. So he's a strict constructionist. He has a very long public career. The party is convinced that it probably won't find anything it doesn't already know about this man, and they have a very short timetable to look. But they ask Evan to do it anyway. The story takes place a few weeks before Christmas in December, and the Senate is wanting to fast track this man's nomination so they can get him through committee and out for a final floor vote before the holiday recess. So the only clue that Evan has to go on that is different at all from anything that's already publicly known about this man is this innocuous-looking photograph that turns up in a whole box of documents. And it's a picture taken, 10 years earlier of this judge in some unidentified setting with a bunch of other men, and they're all wearing formal dress code clothing, and some maybe early teenage looking young men who are also wearing suits that are sort of awkward and badly fitted. And in the photograph, Evan recognizes a man who is standing on the periphery. And back in Dust, there is a reference to an early case she worked on where she vetted a candidate for the United States Senate in Pennsylvania. And in her background research, she discovered that this man had an unhappy penchant for cruising underage boys on internet chat rooms. And she gets the information, she turns it over to the party, and the person running his campaign promptly puts it in a drawer and doesn't make it public because they're more interested in having this guy, win the Senate seat than losing their shot at tipping the balance of power in Congress. So Evan recognizes this man in the photograph and cannot imagine what possible connection he has to this judge. So that's where the story takes off. And the book involves her process of trying to pull this one thread and see where it leads. And at the same time, Evan's best friend, lifetime best friend, is a Roman Catholic priest, Father Tim. They grew up together in Southwest Philly. Tim is now dealing with a crisis of faith and is thinking about leaving the priesthood on the heels of the grand jury findings that were released in Pennsylvania about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, where they came forward with all of the accounts of sexual abuse of children in different dioceses across Pennsylvania. And they named names. They listed the names of the priests, the victims were coming forward. So it pretty much exploded everything in the Catholic Church in Pennsylvania. So Tim, who was not personally abused, however, did know about these events taking place when he was growing up in the church, and he kept silent and never said anything about it. So you have the juxtaposition of his story with what Evan begins to uncover about this judge and other wealthy and powerful men who with him are all members of one of these ultra-exclusive private clubs called Galileo. And the secrets they share, and you gradually begin to realize that the whole thing is bound up with with the ritualized sexual abuse of these young boys. So that's kind of the plot in a nutshell. So it's a light, fluffy read.
Whew. Yeah, I don't know if you could have picked the release timing any better.
Because...
that's the world we live in.
The election, sure. Now that I did not plan. The timing for the release was really more a function of... Well, that's not actually true. Salem, the publisher of Bywater, does nothing by accident. So it probably is the case that, this is well timed to coincide with the election. And I tried very hard. It's important to note, too, that with this book, although the judge in this book happens to be a conservative Republican. This is not a book that makes judgments or deals with political ideologies or philosophies at all. Because in the first book, Dust, the bad guy in that book was a Democrat. So I try to be an equal opportunity, author when it comes to kind of spreading the joy around on those things. But I'll also add that for anyone who did read Dust, Evan and Julia are now in a continuing committed relationship. And they're trying to work their way through the logistics of that. Julia has moved from New York City to Philadelphia, and Evan's teenage daughter, Stevie, is now starting to look at colleges, and Stevie begins to come to terms with her own sexual identity in the book. So there are all these other themes that are woven in and around this other story. And by the end of the book, all of the stories of these different characters coalesce and come together in a really surprising way. And the thing that actually ends up being the linchpin of the whole mystery comes from a place that you absolutely would never predict.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. By the time this episode goes up, I will have read it. I haven't read it yet, and I'm very excited.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. So, is there anything else that you would want to say or share, about this, about writing from a political perspective? Or
well, when you said early on when we were talking about this topic, and you had mentioned that, one way or another, writing books about lesbians is political by definition, and I do agree with that. And I also believe that maybe particularly in the world we live in now, where we are living in some kind of binary vacuum, where our understanding of even what it means to be human is blowing up all around us. And the sort of culture of narcissism that not only pervades our political discourse, but just our culture at large. Like you can't even go on the internet and read your email or look at Facebook or anything without being barraged by all of this commercialization and advertising that's specifically targeted to you, and things that are known and understood about you and your likes and your dislikes and the places you go and what you shop and buy and all of that, and how we're all kind of wandering around in this wilderness without a center, without a shared moral compass, which we just don't have anymore. We don't have a shared moral center at all. So I feel that as we write and tell our stories, it's important for us. I mean, I guess, like Toni Morrison, who just passed away, she talked about how she felt, I'll say this badly, but that her job and her responsibility as a writer was to sit down and witness the lives of the people around her. The people who are regarded as other or as outcasts, or as the ones who are identified as the group that doesn't belong, and whether that's women or minorities or immigrants or gay people, those of us who are other, whose stories are rejected, and the people who are told that their lives and their experiences don't matter or don't have value or lack legitimacy, that we who are storytellers have a responsibility to witness those lives and those experiences in ways that are broader than who we go to bed with and who we have sex with and the romances that we have. And I think for me particularly, as I approach, legitimately probably the last chunk of my life, it's more important than ever for me to write about themes that touch on the real lives we live, and not just the fantasies we like to have and learn about or share. That books that deal with love and romance and sex are important and have a place, but we also have a responsibility to write about other things that inform our life experiences and who we are. That's what I'm trying to do anyway. And, the last thing that I think, Toni Morrison's probably challenge to all of us was to, as she said, write less and say more. Write less and say more. Oh, you know what? And there is one other thing that I'd really like to share with you about the process of doing Galileo that was really different for me and different from my other books. I took a huge risk, a huge personal risk on this book. And I actually hired, I'm reluctant to say professional because I don't want to suggest that other editors in our world are not professional, because they are. But I hired a professional writing coach, an editor, to work with me on this book after I'd finished it, and to read it and do what she called a developmental edit. She'd never read any of my other books. She knew me but didn't know anything about me or what my books were typically like. And I got a lot of incredible feedback from her, and I learned a lot of things. And there were a couple things in particular that she noted, and one of them was really brought me up by the short hairs. There is a very pivotal scene at the end of Galileo where one of the main characters discovers a folder full of graphic photographs that show sexual situations taking place between these men and some of these young boys. And I did not describe the pictures. I did through, I felt, just through the context and through the character's reaction, I felt that it was clear about what the content of the images was. So I did not write that. And the editor I was working with very, very carefully asked me about that. And she knew enough about me to understand that, that I had been a victim of sexual violence, because I'm very open. I talk about that. And she asked me if what she understood as my reluctance to write about that, to describe that, derived from my personal experience. Was it just too hard for you to do that? And I was kind of stunned by that question, and I said, no, that isn't why I didn't write it. I don't have any difficulty talking about what happened to me or being vocal about it. What I had to come to terms with was the fact that for many years, attending conferences and sitting in on panels and listening to readers and listening to other writers in our world who say very directly, I don't want to write about that. I don't want to read that. I don't want to know about that. I don't want those things to exist in our literature. So I reject that. I choose not to write about that. So I knew, whether I was conscious of it or not, when I got to that point in the story, that if I did describe the photographs, if I did kind of go there, that I would run the risk of antagonizing or alienating a lot of my readers. And I chose not to do it. And that was very difficult for me to have to own up to, that I made what it's impossible to view as anything other than a pragmatic or a kind of market-driven decision not to do something hard because I didn't want to offend anybody. Mm-hmm. So I think early on when you and I first started talking, I told you that that the final version of the book has an extra scene, that I added a scene near the end. That's the scene that I added. So I did write it. Mm-hmm. I did write it, and I did put it in there because I realized that, I can't do this craft. I can't be honest, and I can't witness to my life and to the lives of other people if I make decisions that are based on economics and selling more copies of a book. So that's a kind of a personal revelation for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's all for this episode. How can people find you online if they would like to connect with you?
I do make furtive, elusive, occasional, sporadic appearances on Facebook. I have a website, annmcman.com, which actually is under construction. And if we can ever get the damn thing launched, it's going to be great. And it's going to be a good place to connect with me. Apart from that, Facebook, Twitter, they can always email me, and you can also find out about me and about my books at bywaterbooks.com.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for asking, Tara.
So, I'm Tara, and you've been listening to Les Do Books. You can email me at tara@thelesbianreview.com with your questions or comments. If you're an author who's interested in joining me on the show to talk about the lesfic you love or trends that have you interested, please let me know. If you've enjoyed this episode, please check out the show notes where you'll find a Patreon link for The Lesbian Talk Show, or visit patreon.com/thelesbiantalkshow. Our patrons get exclusive content like bonus podcasts and author interviews that no one else gets access to. To find this and many other great shows, all you need to do is search for The Lesbian Talk Show on iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, or Spotify.